At 8:12 on the morning of my wedding, my mother sent me a photograph of 2 champagne glasses above a field of clouds and wrote, "Paris was the only date that worked for us." I was Olivia Grant, 39, standing in the service corridor of a restored textile mill in Asheville, North Carolina, with my grandmother's silver thimble pinned inside my dress and 46 guests waiting beyond a pair of oak doors. My parents believed the worst thing they had done was leave 2 empty chairs in the front row. They did not know that the woman assigned to seat 4C beside them had spent 12 years administering my grandmother's trust, and she recognized both their names before the plane left Charlotte. I read the message once. Then I handed my phone to Daniel and asked whether the quartet was ready. He looked at the photograph, looked at me, and did not offer the kind of comfort that requires the injured person to excuse anyone. He tucked the phone into the inside pocket of his jacket and said the cellist had broken a string but carried a spare. That was one of the reasons I married him. He understood that a crisis did not always deserve the largest room available. Sometimes it belonged in a pocket until the next necessary decision. The corridor smelled of beeswax, wet brick, and rosemary, from the sprigs Daniel's aunt had tied around the place cards. My veil kept catching against one rough place in the plaster, so I lifted it over my arm and waited while the coordinator counted backward with her fingers. Through the doors I could hear chairs shifting and the muted cough of somebody trying not to be noticed. My parents' seats had white ribbons across the backs because my mother had insisted that immediate family should be visually distinguished in the photographs. The ribbons remained, the people did not. At 8:19, 7 minutes after the champagne picture arrived, an email appeared on my screen from Francis Bell. The subject line read, "Urgent, Ruth Grant Trust Asset." Francis had retired from trust administration 3 years earlier and moved to Savannah. I had not seen her since my grandmother's memorial. The first sentence asked whether I had signed any consent authorizing the sale of the cottage on Lake Lure. The second sentence said she was currently seated beside Robert and Elaine Grant on American Airlines Flight 786 to Paris through Philadelphia. The third sentence said, my father had just told a flight attendant that the cottage would be converted into something useful before I returned from my honeymoon. The coordinator reached the end of her count. I locked the screen and walked through the doors. I did not spend my wedding studying my parents' betrayal. I watched Daniel's 11-year-old niece scatter flower petals in clumps because she had misunderstood the instruction to spread them evenly. I heard the old mill windows rattle when rain crossed the river. I noticed that Daniel's hands shook during the vows and stopped shaking when I took them. I signed the marriage license with a fountain pen that had belonged to his grandfather. When the photographer arranged the family pictures, we filled the 2 ribbon chairs with the women who had altered my dress and delivered 3 pans of food before sunrise. No one pretended the chairs had been meant for them. We simply refused to photograph absence as authority. 20 minutes into the reception, Frances sent a second email. She had heard my parents discuss a closing appointment scheduled for the following Tuesday. My mother had said the proceeds would cover the Europe years they believed they deserved after raising children. My father had mentioned that a title company had asked for one more signature, but that his broker had found a solution. Frances wrote that she did not know what documents they possessed, but she still held the final certified copy of my grandmother's trust and a 2009 amendment requiring my written consent before any sale to a buyer outside the family. She had scanned the amendment from her home archive before leaving for the airport because my father had called her 2 weeks earlier with what he described as a routine historical question. That was the counterweight my parents could not see from their business class seats. They thought distance would place them beyond the reach of the family argument they expected. In reality, the woman beside them possessed the one version of the trust they had omitted from the packet sent to the title company. I owned Grant Restoration Works, a 12-person company that repaired historic houses, churches, and public buildings across western North Carolina. My days began in steel-toed boots and usually ended with lime dust inside the seams of my clothes. I knew how to identify a wall that had been painted to conceal moisture, a beam that looked sound until a probe entered the rot, and a staircase that could carry ordinary weight but fail under a crowd. Owners often wanted me to make old damage disappear. My job was to preserve what remained without lying about what had been lost. That habit made me useful at work and inconvenient in my family. My mother called documentation pessimism. My father called boundaries ingratitude. When I photographed a cracked foundation before beginning repairs, clients thanked me. When I saved family emails, my parents said I was building a case against people who loved me. For years, I accepted that contradiction because I believed competence would eventually earn the same respect at home that it earned everywhere else. It took me too long to understand that some people do not misjudge your competence. They recognize it and work hardest where they expect you not to use it. Daniel taught middle school music in Buncombe County. He was the kind of man who kept spare reeds for children whose parents forgot concert nights and knew which student needed a granola bar before rehearsal. We met when my crew restored the stage floor in his school auditorium. He watched me refuse a cheaper coating because it would make the boards look new while sealing in moisture underneath. 3 months later, he asked me to dinner at a barbecue place where the napkin dispenser had been repaired with blue painter's tape. He never described my seriousness as a defect that romance should cure. My parents had offered to pay for half the wedding, but their offer included a guest list, a country club venue, a pastor I had not seen since childhood, and a promise that my father would speak for 10 minutes before dinner. When I declined, my mother said I was denying them the traditional role of the bride's family. I told her tradition was welcome to attend without purchasing control. Daniel and I paid for the meal ourselves. I transferred the money from my business account as an owner's draw, entered it properly, and kept the wedding small enough that each guest had some living connection to our lives. My father later told relatives that we had chosen a Friday morning ceremony to punish working people. In fact, the mill offered the date at 1/3 the Saturday price, and most of our guests were teachers, tradespeople, retirees, or family members who planned ahead. My mother told my aunt that I had designed the schedule as a loyalty test. That explanation became useful when my parents booked Europe after receiving the invitation. They could abandon the wedding and still claim the abandoned person had created the conflict. Elaine and Robert Grant were not visibly cruel people. They mailed birthday cards on time, brought expensive wine to dinner, and remembered the names of other people's grandchildren. My mother chaired the hospitality committee at church and could assemble a funeral reception before the family had selected a casket. My father sold commercial insurance for 32 years and built a reputation for returning calls. Strangers experienced them as attentive. Their private failures came with plausible explanations, clean clothing, and a willingness to speak first. They purchased the Paris tickets on February 14th, 6 weeks after our printed invitations arrived. My mother later showed me the confirmation while pretending she had booked the trip the previous summer. The date appeared beneath the airline logo in 12-point type. When I pointed to it, she said I was focusing on paperwork because I lacked emotional maturity. My father said the fare had been unusually low and that adult children could not expect parents to organize retirement around every celebration. I might have accepted that as another painful choice if the cottage had not entered the conversation. The Lake Lure property belonged to my grandmother Ruth before it belonged to any trust. She bought it in 1974 with wages saved from a hosiery mill and a loan from a credit union that required my grandfather's signature, even though the money was hers. The cottage was small, cedar-sided, and built on a slope that made every repair more expensive than it appeared. Its screened porch faced a strip of water between two ridges. A pencil mark inside the pantry recorded my height at 9. Another mark, lower and darker, recorded the level the lake reached during a storm in 1994. Ruth did not treat the cottage as a symbol of wealth. She treated it as a place requiring annual work. Every April, somebody washed mildew from the porch rail. Every October, somebody drained the pipes. She saved screws in baby food jars and wrote the room name on masking tape around each lid. When a hinge failed, she repaired it before discussing whether the door looked pretty. She was the first person who taught me that maintenance was love performed before an emergency made it visible. The silver thimble pinned inside my dress had belonged to her. It was dented along one edge and dark in the grooves from decades of use. She wore it while repairing my grandfather's work shirts at the kitchen table. When I was 12, I asked why she kept using something so plain when my mother had given her a decorative porcelain thimble covered in roses. Ruth said the porcelain one was made to be admired, and the silver one was made to protect a finger. She saw no reason to confuse the two. In 2007, after my grandfather died, Ruth placed the cottage and several investment accounts into a revocable trust. Frances Bell worked for the bank's private trust department and helped Ruth understand the difference between giving someone a right to use a property and giving that person power to sell it. The original instrument allowed my parents to use the cottage during their lifetimes if they paid ordinary expenses and did not encumber or transfer the property. I held the remainder interest. Ruth wanted me to receive the cottage after their use ended, because I had already begun repairing it, and because, as she told Frances, I understood that old places were not checking accounts with roofs. 2 years later, Ruth added the amendment Frances mentioned on the plane. My father had begun discussing a development project that would have replaced 3 neighboring cottages with larger vacation homes. Ruth feared that he would describe a sale as necessary maintenance. The amendment required my written consent for any transfer outside the family and directed the trustee to obtain an independent appraisal. Frances kept a certified copy because the bank served as trustee until Ruth's death. My parents received copies. I received one as well, but my copy disappeared from the cottage file after Ruth's memorial. I did not accuse anyone when I noticed it missing. At that time, I still believed suspicion itself could damage a family more than the conduct producing it. I asked my mother whether she had moved the file. She said grief was making me forgetful. My father said lawyers always generated duplicate paper, and that I should stop treating every missing staple like Watergate. I let the answer stand because Ruth had just died, because relatives were carrying casseroles through the house, and because I was exhausted from 6 months of driving between Asheville and Lake Lure to help with her care. Those 6 months were the sacrifice my parents later edited out. Ruth's lungs failed gradually after years of mill dust and recurrent pneumonia. My mother handled medical appointments when they fit around committee meetings. My father paid 2 invoices and spoke often about them. I rearranged jobs, declined a profitable hotel restoration in Greenville, and spent 3 nights a week at the cottage because Ruth wanted to remain there as long as possible. Daniel drove out after school with groceries and graded music theory worksheets at the kitchen table, while I changed bedding and checked the oxygen concentrator. Ruth never asked me to keep score. I did not. That became one of my mistakes. Silence can protect the dignity of a person receiving care, but it can also allow other people to inherit a false history of who provided it. After Ruth died, my parents told friends that the family had rallied around her. The word family absorbed the individual labor so completely that no one had to say who came at 2 in the morning when the concentrator alarm sounded. The thimble entered the trust file because Ruth taped it to a handwritten note for Frances. The note said, "Give this to Olivia when she becomes responsible for the house. She knows the difference between keeping and displaying." Frances delivered it to me after the memorial, in a small manila envelope. I carried it in the tool chest of my truck for almost a year before moving it to my jewelry box. On my wedding morning, I pinned it inside the dress because Ruth was the person whose presence I most wanted, without pretending death could be reversed. The first sign that my parents intended to sell the cottage arrived on March 11th, when a real estate photographer knocked while one of my carpenters was replacing porch lattice. He said Robert Grant had hired him to prepare marketing images. My mother later described him as an insurance inspector. When I called the company printed on his car door, the receptionist confirmed a real estate photography appointment and apologized for the confusion. I wrote down the date and asked my father directly whether he planned to list the property. He laughed. Then he said, "You always need a problem to solve." On March 18th, he emailed a broker named Stephen Klein. I did not see that email until much later, but its language became important. My father described himself as the beneficial owner and said his daughter had a sentimental future interest that would not interfere with closing. He attached the first 21 pages of the trust, but not the 2009 amendment. He also wrote that the trustee had retired and that no active administration remained. That was false. Frances had retired from the bank, but the bank's successor department still held administrative authority for restricted transactions. On April 3rd, my father asked me to send a photograph of my driver's license. He said the insurer required updated identification for everyone connected to the cottage. The request arrived by text while I was standing on scaffolding inside an old courthouse. I asked for the insurer's form and contact information. He replied with a thumbs up emoji and never sent either. On April 19th, my mother changed the property tax mailing address from the cottage to their home in Charlotte. She was permitted to receive routine notices, but the change concealed a request for a tax status certificate linked to a prospective sale. I discovered it because the county's online record showed the update, and because Ruth had taught me to check property information every spring before storm season. When I asked why the address had changed, my mother said retired people were entitled to simplify their paperwork. On May 7th, a title company in Hendersonville mailed me a beneficiary questionnaire. The envelope went to the cottage, where my carpenter found it beneath the door. The form asked whether I consented to transfer, and whether any unrecorded agreements affected the property. I called the closing assistant listed at the bottom. She sounded relieved. She said the sellers had represented that my consent was unnecessary, but the trust schedule referred to a later instrument that had not been supplied. I told her I had not authorized a sale and would respond in writing after obtaining counsel. That call should have stopped the matter. Instead, it taught my parents where the transaction was weak. My mother called that evening and asked why I was speaking to their private professionals. She said the sale would fund a smaller condominium for them and relieve me of future maintenance. I reminded her that the trust did not permit them to convert the cottage into retirement cash. She answered that Ruth had not understood modern expenses and that dead people should not control living families forever. Then she softened her voice and said she hoped I would not ruin our wedding over a house. The order of that sentence mattered. She connected the wedding to the sale before I had accused her of connecting them. On May 22nd, my cousin Claire called to congratulate me and casually mentioned that my parents had finally sold the lake place. She believed I had received an early distribution years earlier. When I asked where she heard that, she went quiet. My father had told relatives that Ruth compensated me for renovation work by transferring my share. In reality, the trust accountings showed that my company's material purchases were credited as preservation contributions, not distributions. I had donated hundreds of hours and been reimbursed for some supplies. He turned partial reimbursement into a story of payment, because payment would make my consent appear unnecessary. On May 26th, I drove to the cottage and opened the locked desk where Ruth had kept tax receipts. The original trust binder was gone. In its place sat a photocopy missing the amendment and 3 annual accountings. The brass key still turned smoothly. Nothing looked disturbed. That neatness frightened me more than a broken lock would have. Somebody had not searched the desk. Somebody knew exactly what to remove. I photographed the drawer, called Daniel, and told him I was finally ready to hire an attorney. He did not say he had been waiting for me to admit it. He asked whether I wanted him to drive out. I said no, then changed my mind before the sentence ended. He arrived with sandwiches and sat on the porch while I listed every event from the photographer through the missing binder. We did not discuss punishment. We discussed preserving the property long enough to understand what had already been attempted. On May 28th, attorney Maya Chen sent a written notice to my parents, the broker, and the title company, stating that I disputed any authority to sell without my consent. She requested the complete trust packet and closing file. My parents did not answer Maya. They called my mother's sister, 2 cousins, and our pastor. By Memorial Day, the family version was that I had retained a lawyer to seize a vacation home from elderly parents who needed financial security. That version worked because it used familiar American roles. Parents were assumed to have sacrificed. Adult daughters were expected to become flexible. Retirement was treated as a moral claim. A house near a lake sounded like luxury, even when the dispute concerned authority rather than need. My parents did not have to explain the omitted amendment if the audience accepted that a good daughter would sign whatever allowed them to enjoy Europe. If you have ever watched relatives turn a document into a personality test, you know why I stopped arguing in the group chat. I saved the messages and answered only questions that could be answered with facts. Tell me in the comments which family responsibility was called love, only while you were the one carrying it. Subscribe if you value stories where the quiet person does not need to become cruel in order to become clear, because the next thing my parents attempted depended entirely on my continued politeness. On June 2nd, 3 days before the wedding, I received an automated email from a remote notarization platform. It asked me to verify my identity for a consent document. The email address attached to the request was an old account I had used before starting my company. The phone number ended in digits belonging to my mother. I did not open the session. Maya contacted the platform's compliance department and asked them to preserve the request, the uploading account, and the identification information submitted. My father called within an hour. He said technology had made a harmless mistake and accused Maya of treating administrative confusion like a felony. I asked who uploaded the consent. He said the broker's office handled paperwork. The broker later denied creating the request. My mother said she had offered her number because I was often difficult to reach. Neither explanation addressed why anyone attempted to notarize my signature when I had expressly refused consent. The following morning, my parents left for Charlotte Douglas. They did not call me. My mother posted a photograph of matching luggage beside the airport fountain and captioned it, "Choosing Joy." Underneath, friends wrote that they deserved the trip. One relative asked whether they would be back for the wedding. My mother replied with a sad face emoji and wrote, "We tried to make everything work." Frances boarded after them. She later told me she recognized my father's voice before she saw his face. Seat 4C was beside 4D, where my mother sat. Frances had upgraded with points because of a hip replacement and intended to sleep through the first leg. My parents did not recognize her. At Ruth's meetings, Frances wore conservative suits and kept her silver hair pinned tightly. On the plane, she wore loose linen, sunglasses, and a navy scarf. My father referred to her as the Savannah Lady when asking the flight attendant to exchange meal choices. They began discussing the cottage before takeoff. My mother worried that I might appear at the title company. My father said the Paris timing solved that because I would be distracted by the wedding and then leave for a honeymoon. He said the consent problem was being handled through an older contact route. My mother asked whether that could be traced. He answered that no one investigates family paperwork when everybody agrees about the intended result. Frances kept her eyes closed. She opened the notes application on her phone beneath the blanket and entered times beside the phrases she could remember exactly. She did not record audio. She did not photograph them. She wrote contemporaneous notes, then emailed herself a copy before the aircraft door closed in Philadelphia. During the layover, she called the bank's trust office, confirmed the amendment remained in its archive, and asked a former colleague to place a temporary internal alert on any inquiry involving the cottage. My parents' confidence increased after the plane crossed the Atlantic. They drank champagne and told a flight attendant they were celebrating freedom from family obligations. My mother described the wedding as small and unconventional, words she used when she wanted disapproval to sound tasteful. My father said the cottage proceeds would reimburse them for decades of upkeep. Frances knew from the accountings that the trust had paid taxes and major repairs while my parents covered utilities during their visits. She did not confront them. That restraint mattered. Had she announced her identity over the Atlantic, my parents might have changed their story, contacted the broker, or destroyed records before landing. Instead, Frances listened until she knew enough to distinguish careless boasting from an active transaction. She sent me the first email as the plane waited to depart Philadelphia, and the second after the cabin reached cruising altitude. On May 30th, Maya asked me to come to her office with every document I possessed, including items I considered insignificant. Her office occupied the second floor of a converted house near Pack Square. The waiting room had a coffee machine that hissed every 4 minutes, and a framed photograph of a mountain courthouse in winter. I arrived with a contractor's file box, Ruth's old expense envelopes, 3 flash drives, and the wedding seating chart, because my mother had written notes on the back during an argument about guests. Maya did not laugh at the seating chart. She turned it over, saw a reference to the cottage broker beside my father's name, and added it to the chronology. We spent 3 hours separating what I knew from what I inferred. I knew the photographer had been hired for marketing. I knew the tax address changed. I knew a title company asked for consent. I knew a remote notary session had been initiated with my old identification and my mother's number. I inferred that my parents intended to complete the sale during the wedding and honeymoon. Maya drew a line between the categories and told me the line protected credibility. She said a court did not need me to prove my parents' souls. It needed admissible facts, a threatened interest, and a remedy narrow enough to prevent irreversible harm. The distinction steadied me. Family arguments had always required me to defend an entire lifetime at once. If I objected to a missing document, my mother raised every holiday I had attended late. If I questioned money, my father listed tuition payments from 20 years earlier. Maya refused that scale. She treated each act as something with a date, actor, document, and consequence. For the first time, I understood how much confusion my parents created by forcing every specific concern into a trial of whether I was a loving daughter. That afternoon, Maya ordered a certified copy of the recorded trust memorandum and contacted the bank's successor office. The public memorandum did not contain every private term, but it confirmed that the cottage remained associated with the trust and that my parents' use was not simple fee ownership. She also asked the title company to preserve the closing file, including communications with the broker and proposed sellers. The title attorney replied within an hour. He had already placed a caution flag because the trust packet appeared incomplete, and because the remote consent request had not been completed. My parents responded through family rather than counsel. Aunt Linda called to say retirement frightened them and asked whether I could sign now and challenge the distribution later. My cousin Mark said property disputes destroyed families and suggested splitting the proceeds 3 ways, even though the trust did not create 3 ownership shares. Our pastor left a voicemail offering mediation before legal positions hardened. Every request asked me to release the asset first and discuss authority afterward. No one suggested my parents postpone the closing while questions were answered. The rehearsal dinner occurred that evening in a brewery's back room. Daniel's mother had reserved 6 tables and decorated them with mason jars of grocery store daisies. My parents' place cards remained on the table because removing them would have required explaining the trip to Daniel's relatives before I wanted to. At 7:26, my mother texted that their airport hotel had upgraded them to a suite. At 7:41, she asked whether I had reconsidered letting the lake situation go. She did not ask how the rehearsal was proceeding. I placed the phone face down beside my plate. Daniel's father stood and told a story about Daniel conducting a middle school band through a fire alarm because the students had finally found the difficult measure and refused to stop. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. The evening did not become false, because part of my attention remained on the cottage. Human beings can experience injury and joy in the same hour. My parents often treated any visible happiness as evidence that nothing serious had happened. I stopped granting them that logic. After dinner, Claire found me near the loading dock. She asked whether my parents truly planned to miss the ceremony. I said their plane left at 7:05 the next morning. She stared at the asphalt and admitted that my mother had told her the wedding date was moved after the tickets were purchased. I showed her the invitation order receipt from December and the ticket confirmation from February. Claire covered her mouth with one hand. That was the first time someone in the family saw a contradiction and did not immediately ask me to make it less uncomfortable. She then mentioned the roof story. My mother had told her to call me during the honeymoon and say a storm damaged the cottage, so I would authorize an emergency wire. Claire did not know the amount or destination. She thought my parents wanted money for repairs. Maya later determined that the proposed closing statement included a holdback labeled Emergency Roof Reserve. If I had wired funds after the sale, the payment could have been described as proof that I accepted the transaction or shared its expenses. The plan depended on family concern arriving before information. I asked Claire to save every message and not warn my parents that she had spoken to me. She looked frightened by the secrecy. I told her preserving evidence was not the same as joining a side. She could decide later what she believed after the documents were available. That mattered because my parents had recruited relatives by demanding emotional allegiance before disclosing facts. I would not copy the method while trying to expose it. At 5:18 on the wedding morning, I woke before the alarm and checked the weather. The forecast showed rain until noon. A message from the mill confirmed that the river had not reached the loading entrance. A message from my foreman confirmed that the courthouse scaffolding was secure. There was nothing from my parents. I showered, ate half a banana, and pinned Ruth's thimble into a small piece of ribbon sewn inside the bodice. The metal rested against my ribs when I breathed deeply. Daniel arrived at 6:30 with coffee and a paper bag containing biscuits. Tradition said we should not see each other before the ceremony. We had already discarded enough traditions that morning. He sat on the floor while the stylist worked and read aloud the weather cancellations from his school district's messaging app. The ordinary details kept the day attached to our actual life. At 7:03, the airline app showed my parents' flight boarding. At 7:05, it pushed back from the gate. At 7:12, my mother posted choosing joy. At 8:12, the champagne photograph reached me. Frances later reconstructed her own morning with the same care. She arrived at Charlotte Douglas before 6, used the priority security lane because of her hip implant card, and purchased tea near Concourse B. When the gate agent changed her seat from 3A to 4C because of an equipment swap, she almost objected. She preferred windows. The assignment placed her beside my parents by chance, but what followed was not chance. Recognition required memory, and action required her willingness to risk being called intrusive by people who benefited from being overheard. During the Philadelphia connection, my father opened a laptop and reviewed a draft closing statement. Frances could see only the headings when he angled the screen toward my mother. One line listed sale proceeds of $842,000 after commissions, taxes, and payoff of a small line of credit I did not know existed. Another line directed the net proceeds to an account at a Charlotte bank. Frances did not photograph the screen. She wrote down the visible amount and bank name, then later asked the trust office whether any approved borrowing encumbered the cottage. The answer was no. That possible line of credit became a separate problem. The title company found an unrecorded application my father had submitted using the cottage as collateral, but the lender had not funded it because ownership documentation was incomplete. He later claimed it was only a pre-qualification. The application identified him as sole owner and estimated the property value at $900,000. It also listed rental income that had never existed. The lender closed the application after receiving notice of the trust and preserved the file. By the time Frances's email reached me, 3 institutions possessed fragments of the same story. The title company had the incomplete trust packet, the notary platform had the identity request, and the lender had the sole owner application. None could see the entire pattern until Maya connected them. My parents had relied on compartmentalization. Each professional was supposed to see one document, accept one explanation, and never compare the family's representations across systems. The comparison began while my bouquet was still on the reception table. Maya asked the title company not to release its file to family members without preserving the original metadata. She asked the bank to confirm whether Frances's certified copy matched the archive. She advised me not to access my parents' accounts, devices, or private correspondence even if relatives offered passwords. Evidence gathered lawfully would be slower, but it would survive scrutiny. I carried that advice into every decision that followed. At 6:40 the morning after the wedding, Frances entered the hotel lobby wearing the same navy scarf and carrying a slim document case. Daniel and I were still dressed for breakfast with relatives. My hair contained more pins than I remembered the stylist using, and the lobby coffee tasted like hot cardboard. Frances apologized for arriving unannounced. Then she placed the certified amendment, 3 accountings, and her handwritten flight notes on a low table between us. The amendment carried Ruth's signature, 2 witnesses, and the bank's acceptance. It did not make me owner of the cottage that morning. It did something narrower and more important. It made my written consent a condition of any outside sale. The accountings documented my restoration contributions. Frances's notes did not prove every attempted act, but they connected the wedding timing to the transaction and explained why immediate preservation was necessary. Maya joined by video. She asked Frances to describe what she heard without interpreting motives. Frances did. Maya then called the title company's attorney and confirmed that no policy would issue while the trust restriction remained unresolved. In American real estate practice, a buyer and lender usually need marketable title, and a title company does not insure through a known dispute simply because one family member calls another unreasonable. The closing scheduled for Tuesday was placed on hold before my parents reached their hotel in Paris. Daniel brought the hotel business center scanner upstairs and fed pages through one at a time. He labeled the files with dates rather than emotions. Amendment. Certified 2009, accounting 2018. Frances, notes, flight 786. I watched him work and felt the strange relief of seeing loyalty expressed as competent labor. He did not ask whether my parents deserved consequences. He asked whether page 7 had scanned clearly. By 9:15, certified copies were on their way to the title company, the Brokers' Council, and the bank's successor trust department. Maya also sent a preservation notice to the remote notarization platform. We did not post anything in the family chat. We did not contact the Paris hotel. We went downstairs to breakfast, where Daniel's aunt was wrapping leftover biscuits in napkins, and my new nephew was trying to carry 6 orange juice glasses at once. My parents learned about the suspended closing from Stephen Klein, the broker. My father called me 12 times before noon. My mother left 2 voicemails saying she could not believe I would embarrass them during a once-in-a-lifetime trip. Neither message mentioned my wedding. Neither acknowledged the attempted notarization. The injury they recognized was the interruption of their plan. I returned one call with Maya listening. My father said Ruth's amendment was outdated and that Frances had no right to interfere. I said I would communicate through counsel about the property and directly about non-financial family matters after the honeymoon. He asked whether that meant I was cutting them off. I answered that it meant the subject he wanted to discuss had entered a process where dates and authority mattered more than volume. Our honeymoon was 3 nights in Charleston, not the 2-week trip my parents had described to relatives. Daniel and I had postponed a larger vacation because his school calendar and my company's courthouse project did not permit it. We walked the Battery in humid air, ate shrimp and grits at a crowded restaurant, and spent one afternoon inside because a storm flooded the street. I checked email twice a day. Maya sent short updates. The title company had received the amendment. The buyer had paused financing. The remote notary platform had preserved the identity session. The bank had located Ruth's original trust file. The preserved session showed that the person initiating it uploaded an image of my driver's license taken years earlier, before I changed addresses. The selfie check had not been completed, which was why the request reached me instead of producing a notarized document. The platform logs showed the session originated from the Wi-Fi network at my parents' Charlotte home, 2 hours before they left for the airport. My mother's phone number was entered as the contact number. When Maya disclosed those facts to my parents' new attorney, the explanation changed. They no longer blamed the broker. They said my father had been testing whether the platform worked. Then they said they believed the old license image was part of the cottage file, and that sending it to a notary was not the same as signing for me. Finally, they said the proposed consent merely confirmed what Ruth would have wanted if she had understood their needs. Each version moved farther from accident. The family expected the decisive confrontation to occur in a courtroom. It happened first at Sunday brunch in my Aunt Linda's dining room, 9 days after the wedding. Linda had scheduled the brunch before the conflict became public, because relatives from Ohio were still in town. My parents joined by video from a Paris hotel. They positioned the laptop so the Eiffel Tower appeared through the window behind them, though it was distant enough to resemble a gray needle. My mother wore a silk scarf and began by thanking everyone for supporting them during a stressful misunderstanding. The dining table held a spiral ham, deviled eggs, fruit salad, and a stack of wedding photographs Claire had picked up from the 1-hour print counter. The ordinary food made my parents' performance more unsettling. They spoke from a hotel room costing more per night than the average monthly mortgage in our family, and described themselves as elderly people being deprived of security. My father said he had simplified the cottage situation for everyone's future. Then he invited me to confirm that I would sign once I calmed down. I did not answer immediately. I removed Ruth's silver thimble from a small velvet pouch and placed it beside the laptop. The base made a soft metallic sound against Linda's polished table. My mother stared at it before looking at me. She knew what it was. She also knew Ruth had connected it to responsibility for the house. I slid a certified copy of the 2009 amendment beneath the camera. Claire read the operative sentence aloud because she was nearest the laptop and because my father had spent weeks telling her no such condition existed. Her voice slowed when she reached the requirement for my written consent. The room changed in small physical ways. Linda lowered the serving spoon into the ham glaze and left it there. My uncle folded his napkin twice without placing it anywhere. Daniel's thumb rested against the rim of his coffee cup, completely still. My father said the amendment had been superseded. Maya, seated 2 chairs to my right, asked him to identify the later instrument. He said it was probably in the missing family files. Maya replied that the bank's original archive contained no later amendment, and that the closing file had been produced under written request. My mother said legal technicalities should not defeat Ruth's larger intention. That was when Frances entered from the hallway. She had agreed to attend only after Maya confirmed that her testimony might prevent relatives from treating the dispute as competing family memories. She wore a pale blue suit and carried the Navy document case. My father's face changed before Frances introduced herself. Recognition arrived through posture rather than words. He leaned toward the laptop, then back, as if distance from the screen could alter who had occupied seat 4C. Frances said, "Robert, I believe you called me the Savannah lady." That was one of only a few lines she spoke. She identified herself as Ruth's former trust officer, described the seating assignment, and read the times from her notes. She repeated my father's statement that the papers would be signed while I was distracted by the wedding. She repeated my mother's question about whether the older contact route could be traced. She did not add adjectives. She did not tell the room what kind of people my parents were. Exact words did the work. My father accused her of eavesdropping. Frances said the conversation occurred at normal volume in a shared aircraft cabin and that she had not recorded it. My mother said Frances must have misunderstood humor. Frances opened the certified trust file and noted that my father had called her before the trip, asking whether the bank retained obsolete attachments. He had not mentioned a sale. He had been checking where the amendment existed. Maya then placed the title attorney's email on the table. The transaction was suspended. No title policy would issue until the trust restriction, attempted remote notary session, and authority of the proposed sellers were resolved. The bank had opened an internal review. The buyer had withdrawn from the Tuesday closing while reserving rights under the contract. A referral had been made to the title company's fraud prevention unit because the uploaded identification and contact information did not belong to the person whose consent was sought. No one shouted. The refrigerator motor started in the kitchen. Rain tapped once against the dining room window, and then came harder. My mother's hotel image froze for 2 seconds, leaving her mouth open in a shape that looked exaggerated until the connection returned. My father reached toward the laptop camera as though he intended to cover it, but my mother moved his hand away. He blamed Stephen Klein first. Maya forwarded the broker's engagement letter to Linda's printer. It showed my father had represented that all required beneficiaries would cooperate and had instructed the broker to use the incomplete trust packet. Stephen had made his own mistakes, but he had not invented the missing amendment. My mother blamed the title company. The closing assistant produced emails showing she requested my consent twice and warned that the file could not proceed without clarification. My parents answered by sending a legal memorandum copied from an unrelated online article about revocable trusts. The title company had not accepted it. They blamed the remote notary vendor. The vendor's logs identified the Charlotte network, my mother's number, and my old license image. My father said the old image must have been uploaded automatically. The compliance report showed it had been manually selected from a computer folder named Lake House Closing. Finally, my parents blamed Claire. My mother said Claire had assured them I would sign after the wedding. Claire began crying before she spoke. She admitted my parents asked her to tell me the cottage needed emergency roof work, so I would send money during closing week. She had not understood the full transaction. She believed the sale was complete and that I had been paid. Her cooperation was wrong, but it was not the same as creating the plan. I told Claire that correcting the record mattered more than defending the mistake. I asked her to send Maya every message she had received and promised I would not expose her private finances in the family chat. My father called that manipulation. I said nothing in response. Differentiating levels of responsibility was not manipulation. It was the opposite of the blanket loyalty he demanded. My mother turned to the relatives at Linda's table and asked whether anyone truly believed she would steal from her own daughter. The question depended on the word steal because it made every other description sound less serious. I did not use it. I said she had attempted to transfer a trust asset without required consent and had allowed my identity document to be used in a remote notary request after I objected. Those were the facts I was prepared to prove. Her preferred label was not necessary. My father said he had maintained the cottage for decades. Francis opened the accountings. The trust had paid property taxes, insurance, roof replacement, septic work, and structural repairs. My parents paid utilities during periods of use and several small maintenance expenses. My company contributed labor and materials recorded as preservation credits. The numbers did not erase their care for the place, but they ended the story that they alone had financed it. The collapse was not cinematic. It was administrative. The broker terminated the listing. The title company closed the file without completing the sale. The bank petitioned for instructions and appointment of a neutral successor trustee because trust administration had become contested. My parents retained separate counsel from the broker. Their access to the cottage was temporarily limited to scheduled visits while records and property contents were inventoried. The family group chat, usually active every hour, remained silent for 3 days. My parents returned from Paris early. They told friends the trip had been ruined by an aggressive legal campaign. At Charlotte Douglas, my father discovered that the same luggage carousel could deliver expensive suitcases to people whose transaction had failed. No relative met them with a sign. They took a rideshare home. I did not go to their house. I did not post the flight notes or the notary logs. Maya advised that public accusations could complicate the process, but restraint was not only legal strategy. I no longer wanted my life organized around proving that my parents were bad. I wanted the cottage protected, the trust administered correctly, and the people they had recruited to understand enough truth to stop participating. Before the bank completed its review, Margaret arranged an inventory day at the cottage. She invited my parents, their attorney, Maya, me, and a neutral appraiser. The date was October 17th. The lake had dropped for the season, leaving a narrow line of red clay beneath the dock. My parents arrived in my father's SUV with 2 empty plastic bins and said they intended to remove personal possessions. Margaret explained that ordinary clothing and clearly personal items could leave, but furniture, documents, artwork, and objects purchased with trust funds would remain until catalogued. My mother walked through the rooms, touching things she had not mentioned in years. She claimed Ruth's wedding china, then admitted it had been donated to the church auction. She claimed a cedar chest, but the receipt showed the trust purchased it after Ruth's death to store linens. She claimed the brass porch bell because she remembered ringing it as a child. I remembered installing it in 2016 after she selected it from a hardware catalog. Memory was not useless, but it was not an ownership system. The most difficult moment came in the pantry. My father stood beside the pencil marks and said the cottage had been the only place where we were ever happy together. The sentence was partly true. I remembered fishing with him before sunrise, carrying damp towels across the porch, and learning to drive his truck in the gravel turnout. Harm does not erase every good memory. Good memory does not grant a later right to misuse another person's identity. I told him I remembered those mornings and still opposed the sale. He looked genuinely confused that both statements could exist at once. Margaret found the missing trust binder in a locked compartment beneath the guest room window seat. The compartment had been designed for blankets. Inside were the amendment, accountings, broker correspondence, and a printed copy of my old driver's license. My mother said she had moved the binder for safekeeping during Ruth's memorial. She could not explain why the amendment was absent from the photocopy left in the desk. or why the closing folder contained my identification. Margaret sealed the contents in an evidence envelope and listed every page in front of both attorneys. The discovery changed the civil negotiations. Until then, my parents argued that the incomplete packet reached the broker by accident. The intact binder showed they possessed the amendment while supplying a version without it. Their attorney stopped using the phrase innocent oversight. He asked for a private caucus. The appraiser continued measuring rooms, while the adults who had once controlled every family gathering whispered behind the closed bedroom door. I went outside and checked the porch posts with my foreman, Luis, who had come to identify recent repairs. One post showed fresh filler over decay. My father had hired a handyman to make the porch appear sound for photographs, rather than replace the damaged base. Luis pressed a screwdriver through the filler with almost no force. The tool disappeared 2 inches into rotten wood. That image summarized the entire transaction more clearly than any argument. A surface prepared for sale, a defect concealed, and somebody else expected to bear the load afterward. The buyer was a couple from Atlanta who intended to use the cottage as a short-term rental. They had done nothing dishonest. Their agent sent a letter explaining that they withdrew because the title dispute and trust restrictions made the timing impossible. They asked for return of their earnest money and reimbursement of an inspection fee. My parents initially wanted the trust to pay. Margaret refused because the contract had been signed without valid authority. Mediation later allocated the expense to my parents and the broker's insurer. The mediator was a retired judge who met with us in a conference center outside Hendersonville. He began by saying settlement did not require affection or a common memory. It required parties to value risk accurately. My father arrived with a binder titled Family Contributions. It contained utility bills, photographs of him painting shutters, and receipts for groceries purchased during lake weekends. Margaret's accounting showed those expenses alongside the trust's taxes, insurance, structural repairs, and my company's work. The record honored what he had paid without transforming it into ownership. My mother asked to speak to me alone during lunch. Maya advised against it, but I agreed to 10 minutes in a glass-walled side room with the door open. My mother said she felt replaced at my wedding by Daniel's family and punished because she chose one trip after decades of motherhood. I told her the Paris trip and the cottage scheme were connected by timing and by statements she made on the plane. She said Francis had no right to remember private conversation. I asked whether she denied the words. She looked through the glass at the mediator and said memory was complicated. Then she offered the apology she preferred. She was sorry everything had become so painful. The sentence placed pain in the room without identifying an actor. I said I was willing to hear an apology for using my identification, omitting the amendment, and attempting a sale during the wedding. She said legal language made reconciliation impossible. Our 10 minutes ended. I returned to the main room without raising my voice, but the door felt heavier when it closed behind me. The settlement resolved money and access, not the entire relationship. My parents reimbursed the trust for unauthorized professional fees, paid the buyer-related expenses, and agreed that any future use of the cottage would follow a reservation calendar managed by Margaret. They surrendered the right to approve repairs or select vendors. Their lifetime use interest remained because Ruth had granted it, but use no longer included control over records, financing, or sale discussions. Justice did not rewrite the trust in my favor. It enforced the limits already there. My father disliked that distinction. He wanted the outcome described as my victory, so he could describe himself as defeated. Margaret refused both words. She called it administration. Her invoices listed tasks in 6-minute increments: review instrument, confirm insurance, inspect premises, communicate with beneficiaries. The precision irritated my parents because it made the process difficult to convert into a morality play. Every hour had a purpose and a cost. The conflict affected my business in ways I had not predicted. A local developer who knew my father delayed signing a restoration contract because he had heard I was involved in family litigation. I provided references and financial statements, but I did not explain private facts to win the job. The developer chose another contractor. Losing the project hurt. Quiet justice is not cost-free simply because the injured person behaves carefully. 2 months later, the courthouse architect whose building my crew had repaired called with an emergency stabilization project. He said he had watched us document every change and wanted a contractor who would not conceal uncertainty. That contract replaced most of the lost revenue. I did not interpret it as the universe rewarding virtue. It was a professional decision based on visible work. Still, the timing reminded me that reputation built through years of accurate conduct can survive one family's attempt to redefine you. Daniel also paid a price. My father complained to a school board acquaintance that Daniel had encouraged litigation for financial gain. The superintendent asked Daniel for a brief explanation because public school employees are accustomed to rumors becoming personnel questions. Daniel disclosed that the dispute involved my grandmother's trust, that he had no financial role, and that counsel handled it. He did not provide family gossip. The matter ended there, but he came home that evening, quieter than usual, and spent an hour repairing a music stand that could have been replaced for $20. I apologized for the intrusion into his work. He said marrying me did not mean agreeing to be untouched by my family, but it did mean we would decide together how much access they received to our home. We changed the garage code, removed my parents from the emergency contact list at his school, and created a shared folder for any future communication. Those steps felt severe only because we had previously treated unlimited access as normal. During the first Christmas after the settlement, my parents hosted their usual dinner and invited us through Aunt Linda. The invitation said there would be no property discussion. I asked whether they would be willing to meet first with a family therapist who understood financial betrayal. My mother replied that therapy was appropriate for people who could not move on. We declined the dinner. Daniel and I spent Christmas morning at the cottage with Claire, Linda, and 2 apprentices who could not afford to travel home. We cooked pancakes on Ruth's old griddle and repaired a sticking pantry door after breakfast. The absence of my parents at that table did not feel like revenge. It felt like an accurate guest list. Nobody was excluded for disagreeing with me. The condition was simple. People present could not require the target of deception to deny it for the meal to remain pleasant. My mother later posted a photograph of 2 empty chairs and wrote about children forgetting where they came from. I did not respond. Empty chairs can be arranged to tell any story. Conduct remains less cooperative. Months later, my father requested a supervised weekend at the cottage. Margaret approved it under the trust terms. He arrived alone, signed the condition report, and spent 2 days fishing. When he left, the caretaker found the house clean and the keys in the lockbox. No document was missing. No broker had visited. Compliance did not repair trust, but it gave us one fact that did not need interpretation. I recorded it without turning it into proof of transformation. My mother refused supervised use for another year. She said she would not visit a place where her daughter treated her like a criminal. I did not correct the label. The rules applied to both parents because the transaction had involved both of them. She was free to reject access under those terms. A boundary does not force someone to participate. It reveals what they value more than participation. The apprenticeship program began the following June with a 22-year-old carpenter named Nia Howard. On her first morning, she examined the repaired porch post and asked why one section of wood looked newer. I told her the history. Then we discussed moisture paths, load transfer, and why cosmetic filler fails when used where structural material belongs. The lesson belonged to the building before it belonged to my family. That was how the cottage returned to useful life. The bank's review took 4 months. A neutral attorney named Margaret Ellis was appointed as successor trustee. She ordered an independent appraisal, verified the trust's restrictions, and required that future property decisions be made through written notices to every beneficiary. The attempted sale produced costs. My parents lost the buyer's earnest money dispute after mediation, and paid part of the title and legal expenses from their personal funds rather than the trust. The remote notary matter was referred to state investigators. I will not pretend it ended with handcuffs at dawn. Real systems move more slowly and distinguish failed attempts from completed transfers. My parents entered a civil settlement acknowledging that I had not consented, agreeing not to use my identification, and reimbursing fees caused by the false session. The notary platform strengthened the hold on the account that initiated the request. The broker completed additional compliance training and paid his own counsel. The result was less dramatic than revenge and more useful than an apology without terms. Margaret commissioned a preservation assessment of the cottage. The report confirmed roof flashing problems, porch decay, and drainage work that had been postponed, while my parents described a sale as the only practical solution. Daniel and I created a 5-year repair plan. We did not transform the place into a luxury rental. We stabilized the slope, repaired the porch with compatible materials, updated the septic system, and preserved Ruth's pencil marks inside the pantry. I converted the smallest bedroom into a residency space for apprentices learning historic trades. Each summer, one student spent 6 weeks working with local carpenters, masons, and preservation specialists. The program covered housing and a stipend, because I had seen too many trades treated as passions young people should pursue without pay. Ruth's trust did not authorize charitable use, so I funded the program from my business and paid fair rent to the trust during the residency. Margaret insisted on the paperwork. I appreciated her for it. Claire helped inventory family photographs that had remained in the cottage. She corrected her statements in the group chat without asking me to approve the wording first. Her message said she had repeated information she did not verify and had participated in pressuring me about property she did not understand. Some relatives accepted the correction. Others responded with heart emojis and avoided the facts. Repair does not require universal comprehension. My Aunt Linda apologized for believing that age automatically made my parents need more legitimate than my legal interest. She said she had been afraid that challenging them would divide the family. I told her the division existed before she named it. We began having lunch once a month without using the meal to debate who should forgive whom. That was a smaller relationship than the old family mythology promised, but it was real enough to maintain. Frances visited the cottage in October. Rain moved across the lake in long gray bands, and the repaired porch smelled of fresh cedar. We drank coffee from mismatched mugs because Ruth had never owned a complete set. Frances said she had replayed the decision not to confront my parents on the plane. She worried that listening made her intrusive. I told her the difference was what she did with the information. She preserved a vulnerable person's intention and took the evidence to a process capable of evaluating it. She did not turn private knowledge into entertainment. Before she left, I showed her the silver thimble. The dent along the rim caught the afternoon light. Frances said Ruth had taped it to the note with so much adhesive that the bank's records clerk complained for a week. We laughed, and the sound did not diminish anything serious. Objects can carry grief without requiring solemnity every time they appear. My parents received written conditions for future contact. No financial requests. No discussion of trust property outside counsel or the trustee. No unannounced visits. No retelling the wedding as a scheduling accident in my presence. I did not require them to confess motives they might spend the rest of their lives avoiding. I required conduct that could be observed. My mother tested the conditions first. She mailed a long letter that began with childhood memories and ended by asking whether I would withdraw the civil reimbursement claim as a gesture of healing. I returned a brief response through Maya. Emotional correspondence was welcome directly. Financial proposals belonged with counsel. My mother called that cold. I considered it accurate placement. My father sent Daniel an email saying a husband should help reconcile a daughter with her parents. Daniel replied that he would not act as a private channel around a boundary I had stated clearly. He did not defend my personality or list their wrongdoing. He refused the role. That refusal protected our marriage more effectively than any speech about choosing sides. At our first anniversary, Daniel and I returned to the mill. The venue manager let us walk through the empty hall between events. The oak doors were propped open. The white ribbons no longer existed, and no photograph could make the front row feel unfinished. We stood in the service corridor where the champagne message had arrived and listened to another couple's band testing microphones on the far side of the wall. I had once believed that my parents' absence would be the central fact of my wedding. It was not. The central fact was that everyone who came carried some portion of the day without demanding ownership of it. Daniel's aunt packed food. His niece scattered petals badly and joyfully. Francis preserved evidence from a plane. Maya answered a video call on a Saturday morning. Loyalty appeared as work, timing, restraint, and the willingness to tell the truth where it could protect something. The thimble changed meaning across those months. On the wedding morning, it represented the person I wished could fill an empty chair. At brunch, it reminded the room that Ruth's intention had a history my parents could not purchase or edit. Later, on the cottage porch, it became ordinary again, a small tool made to protect a finger while work continued. That final change mattered most. Evidence should not remain trapped forever in the moment it was needed. I did not keep the cottage because a building was more valuable than family. I kept it because my parents had treated my expected forgiveness as a transferable asset. They assumed I would absorb the insult of the wedding, the attempted sale, the misuse of my identification, and the revised family story, because I had absorbed smaller things before. Their calculation failed when I stopped confusing peace with making their plan inexpensive. The lesson was not that parents who miss a wedding deserve to lose everything. It was narrower. Presence is a decision. Consent is a decision. And neither can be manufactured afterward by people who dislike the consequence of their own absence. Ruth's trust protected the property, but Francis's attention protected the intention behind it. One document without a person willing to notice the danger might have remained in an archive until the cottage belonged to someone else. People often say blood is thicker than water when they want the injured person to restore access. At Lake Lure, I learned a different measurement. Water reveals where a foundation drains badly. Blood explains relation, not reliability. The people I trust are the ones who show up before the damage becomes photogenic, preserve what matters without claiming it, and accept that love does not authorize a signature. So I want to ask you something specific. Has anyone in your family ever treated your future forgiveness as permission they could use in advance? Tell me what finally made the arrangement visible. Share this story with someone who is still being told that a boundary destroys family, when the boundary may be the first honest description of what the family has already become. And if you choose to stay connected to people who hurt you, let the connection have terms that can survive the next holiday, the next request, and the next version of the story. My parents were free to go to Paris. They were never free to sign me out of Ruth's intention while I stood at the altar. The woman in seat 4C did not rescue me with a dramatic confrontation. She noticed, verified, and acted before the lie could become a deed. Sometimes justice arrives that quietly.